Good morning. I invite you to open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. Matthew, chapter 24. It was good to be in Matador and spend time with our brothers and sisters there. One of the things that was new for me, I've been blessed to preach a gospel meeting there every year for a number of years. And normally I would just think about surely somewhere in the year there was one or two sermons worth taking on the road, and so I'd sort of gather those up. But because our brethren in Matador are with us today as we stream together, I realized, wait a minute, I can't do that. They've already heard it. So I actually had to work. Everybody say, oh, yeah, it was hard for me. It is a blessing to have the opportunity to give as we did for our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. I know Matador took up a collection while we were there for the folks there going through the ministry Eastern European missions that they have supported there for faithfully for several years, as we do as well here. We've been able to send that money through the Sunset School of Preaching, has an organization called the Global Relief Fund. And as you remember, Fairmont Park, as was discussed last week, has been a part of supporting the preaching school in Kyiv for a long time. And so we're able to use those same contacts, same brethren we know, and so that money is going directly to the churches and the preachers and the church leaders in the Ukraine that they can distribute as they see best, as they see people who are struggling. When the pandemic started, I guess that's been a couple of years ago now, you know, in the early days and weeks, nobody really was for sure how it would really go. And those early days were pretty concerning, as there were some pretty dire predictions about how it would impact even our country and the population around the world. And because of that tension and that anxiety and that uncertainty, it often brings up a question. And I was asked several times early in those days, do I think that we are living in the end times? Is this global pandemic a sign of the end? My answer was yes. We are living in the end times. For the Bible presents this age that we live in as the last one. I think we forget, or at least I do sometimes, that we don't have the same expectation as those of faith have had for centuries and centuries. Since Adam and Eve, God has been promising that He would bring the solution, that He would solve our problem, that He would redeem us, that He promised the Messiah all through the days of Adam and Eve, through the days of men like Abraham. There would be a little more, refinement's not the right word, maybe a little more specific about what was coming in the days of men like Moses and in the law of Moses and about what would be coming. But still, there was God's going to solve this. God's going to send someone. And then as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record, God did. Jesus came. He was born in the flesh, dwelt among us, died on the cross for us, and then was resurrected that we would live. And so the New Testament doesn't have the same kind of expectation. All the rest of human history was waiting for God to send the Redeemer and to rescue us. But since Jesus has come, and since He offered His life on the cross, and as His tomb stands empty as witness, now we celebrate what God has done. There is no new age. There's nothing else. There won't be another Messiah. There won't be another law. There won't be another covenant, for we are living in the last time that God has given us. Now, what we wait for is something different. Rather than the Messiah, rather than the rescue, we wait for the end, which is why we live in the end times. What we don't know is how long those end times will be. See, the disciples asked Jesus a question. I think they were caught off guard at the beginning of the chapter. They're looking at the temple and they're pointing it out to Jesus, which is kind of strange to me because Jesus has seen the temple before. Even just as a Jew that comes to the temple every year for the Passover and so on, he's seen it. So that implies when the disciples are pointing it out, not as if he's a tourist and that's his first view, but just to say, pretty cool, huh? Pretty amazing, isn't our temple? Isn't that amazing? And as they're pointing that out to Jesus, He says something that startles them. In Matthew chapter 24, in verse 2, He said, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So the disciples seem to be saying, look at our temple, isn't this great? It's been remodeled by Herod, and it's been under a remodeling project for decades and decades. We Americans live in a very different kind of culture when it comes to structures. We get pretty impatient if our house isn't finished in a matter of months. We watch a new commercial building go up, and it goes up before our eyes in a matter of weeks, and then occupancy normally comes in a matter of months. But our European friends are used to structures and houses taking lifetimes and generations. And then, of course, they'll live in it for 800 years without remodeling it. Well, in the first century, they're used to structures taking a long time and then staying around a long time. This temple is being remodeled for decades when they're pointing it out to Jesus. Maybe it was some new shiny bit that had just been added. Maybe that's what had caught their eye. But with all the pride and all of the identity that goes with we're Jews and this is our temple, when Jesus says, yeah, you see that? It's all going to be torn down. Would have been startling and devastating to the disciples and to any Jews. So they asked the question, when will this be and when will be the end of the age? They assumed that if the temple were to be destroyed, that would have to be the end of all things. They couldn't imagine a future without the temple, though it was the very future that Jesus was preparing them for. Sometimes we get in a place where our sense of identity and what we know becomes so much a part of our expectations that we can't imagine a future without it. And yet, evidence abounds that nothing stays the same around us. Maybe it's just that desperation of wanting something to stay the same that we hold on to things tightly. When this troubles the disciples, listen to Jesus' answer in verse 4. He said, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." Jesus says that turmoil, that wars and famines and storms and shortages and surpluses, He says that's the nature of the world we live in. That's not going to change. The reason for that, of course, is because it's us. I don't know if I can ask this question in church. I guess I will anyway. Is anybody here Trekkies? A lot more of you than you're willing to admit. That's interesting. One of the common assumptions in science fiction genre, and I won't ask who are Trekkies and who are Star Wars and which is better, I won't even go there. But if you watch any of that or read any of that, if that draws your imagination or if you've thought about that at all, it's interesting that the common theme in science fiction is the unity of mankind. It makes sense. If we could get the whole world to live in peace, could you imagine what we could do? If we lived in peace, the whole globe, think about the money that would be freed up to accomplish or do other things. The money that we waste in war, the lives that are shed in war, the division, the distrust, all the evil that comes out. Even from a local level, if we all got along, imagine if we didn't have to buy locks for the front doors of our houses. Imagine the money we would save. And if we could pool all of that money and time and focus and relationship and energy, then maybe we could build starships and we could explore boldly where no man has gone before. The problem is, we'll never achieve that. We might achieve starships. I hope so. I'd like to build one as a kit and fly that in my lifetime. I'd do that. What could possibly go wrong? But world peace is never going to happen. There was a time, a long time ago, where humanity was more united, more together. And unfortunately, we squandered that resource of unity to try to build a tower that we could reach to heaven and proclaim our own might and strength. And God said, no more of that. That's called the Tower of Babel. It's since been compounded and confirmed by how we live broken lives, that we are sinners and we struggle with jealousy and selfish ambition. James chapter 4, that's what James says. What is the source of your quarrels among you? Is it not your jealousy and selfish ambition? And so the brokenness of our own sin will forever rob us of ever experiencing world peace. That's why Jesus says, you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes, for even creation has been altered because of our sin. Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, and because of the sin in Noah's day, the whole world was destroyed. And things have never been the same since. So Jesus tells us this just to remind us, don't be frightened. That was the point. That doesn't make it good. That doesn't make it okay that we hurt each other and harm each other. That doesn't say that that's not a big deal. It just says the sad truth is, this is how our life will be. This is the world we live in. So what do we do with that? What happens next? If that's how it is, then what happens next? Turn, if you would, to the book of Psalms, the second Psalm. So the nature of the world we live in is it is broken. And it will keep acting like a broken world. That our world will continue to be filled with broken people. And we'll have all the struggles that come from such brokenness. But there's a message for those of us who choose to follow God. As Jesus had already said, that we need not be frightened. We have a different perspective, a different call, and a different destiny. In the second psalm, even King David writes in the first verse, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the people devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. And they say, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." So man in all of his strength and all of his wisdom gets together in all of his force. And from our perspective, that can be really impressive and intimidating. But David writes from a different perspective in verse 4. "He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." David reflects on the nature of humanity and how nations rise up against nations and plan great things and exercise their strength. And then David says, it doesn't impress God at all. In the book of Revelation, much is made in books and in movies of the Battle of Armageddon. It's fascinating. The idea that evil would gather out on the plains, all of this strength, and our imagination really begins to get traction, and we like to fill in the blanks and all of that. But the book of Revelation really makes a sorry movie. Because a good movie is about a backstory and get you to fall in love with a character, bring them through all their struggles, and then they have this mighty, mighty struggle, and at the very end, they're victorious just by the skin of their teeth, just so close. That's what keeps us on the edge of our seat. But the book of Revelation is not a good movie script. Because Satan gathers all of his forces for the great battle of Armageddon. And just as we turn the page, we're ready to read about great wars and about trumpets and about horses and soldiers and it says, and then God destroyed them all. Well, that was a short movie. Because there's no contest, there's no struggle. There's no question about, I don't know if God's going to pull this off. So what David says when he sees nations around Israel, because Israel, through the course of their history, was threatened over and over and over. And some kings struggled so mightily. It would be one nation of, maybe it was Babylon, or it could be Assyria. Sometimes it's Egypt. And they'll begin to muster, and they'll begin to flex their muscle and begin to pressure Israel. And some kings would fail in their faith. Oh no, look at their army and look how many spears they have. This is bad. And so they would go make alliances with these other pagan nations. Hey, would you help? And God says over and over and over, I'm here. Trust me. What David says is, but as for me, because at the end of the day, that's all we can do individually, is that we make a decision. We choose a place to stand. David says, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Would you mind flipping over to the book of Joshua, chapter 24? Joshua 24. You remember in Joshua's life, this 24th verse is at the very end of his life. He was a young man and was following Moses, the great Moses and leader that led them out of Egypt and through the wilderness for 40 years, dealing with crisis after crisis with faith and with trust in God. And Joshua, like Caleb, witnessed the great power of God. In the very first chapter of Joshua, multiple times as God is telling Joshua, you're going to lead the people. And I'm thinking, Joshua was pretty close with Moses. Moses was Joshua's mentor and guide, like a spiritual father to him. And we watched Moses get frustrated and say things like, but a little more and this people will stone me. We watched Moses get frustrated because the people grumble and they gripe. Over and over and over. And finally, Moses loses his temper and strikes the rock when he wasn't supposed to. And then God says to Moses, you're not going to lead my people into the promised land. You'll see it, but you won't go in it. And there's a compelling account where Moses goes up to the mountain and then his life is given and God receives him. Now, Moses' punishment for striking the rock was he didn't get to go to the promised land. But have you ever dwelt on that very long? Moses didn't go to the promised land, the one over in Israel. He went to heaven. If you're not sure about that, in Matthew, when Jesus is transfigured and talking on the mountain, he is transfigured, and all of a sudden he's talking with Moses and Elijah about his departure. Moses is in the presence of God. I've wondered, wouldn't that have been a great time while Moses and Elijah and Jesus were talking? I would have loved to interrupt him and say, can I just ask one question, Moses? And then y'all can get back to your business. But can I just ask you one thing? How did you feel about being taken into heaven rather than going to the promised land with the rest of the Hebrews? Because Moses got so frustrated with their constant grumbling and their lack of faith. And every time he turns around, they're, oh, we wish we were back in Egypt. And he's got to be like, are you kidding me? If they were grumbling during the wilderness wanderings when life was still pretty iffy and maybe they'd starve to death, maybe they'd die of thirst and so on, can you imagine what the people were like when they finally moved into the Promised Land? And all that Promised Land was given to them. Entire cities and homes and farms and structures was just given to them because God drove the people out, the inhabitants, and then gave the Hebrew people that. What are we like when we are given things? If we thought they were grumbling in the wilderness, give it a few years of living in the Promised Land and ask yourself, I wonder if they still grumbled. Is it possible that somebody might have said, how come I was given this house and he was given that one? I like his better than mine. How come I have to have this one? I don't know if living with the Hebrews in the Promised Land would have been the Promised Land for Moses. What he does, or what he receives, is he's taken home. Joshua grew up around all that. He heard all that. So when God said in Joshua chapter 1, you're going to lead the people, I don't think Joshua's like, excellent, promotion. I think he was more like, what did I do wrong? Why are you giving this to me? What you do see is several times in Joshua chapter 1, God tells him, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. I don't think Joshua was afraid of Jericho. I think Joshua was afraid of the burden of leading such a stubborn and obstinate people. So at the end of his life, Joshua talks sternly to them. There's a lot of powerful things in this chapter. He tells them, he says, I don't think y'all are going to be able to be faithful. Oh, no, we will. And you got the book of Judges. You can get to chapter 2 and find out that they're no longer faithful. Doesn't take long at all. So what does Joshua say? Chapter 24, verse 14. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me, David said, but as for me, I will install my king on Mount Zion. Yeah, the nations are in uproar, but as for me, my king is the king. Joshua says, you want to serve the gods in Egypt, where you were enslaved and suffered? You want to serve the gods in this land where the people that served those gods, they were displaced. In both cases, those false gods could do nothing. And those that served them were defeated. He says, you want to do that? That's for you to choose. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Brothers and sisters, that's the one constant and the only constant that matters most in our lives. Whatever else is going on, we'll do what we can, where we can, for sure. But the one constant we can choose today is to say, but as for me, I will install my king on Mount Zion. As for me and my house, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to serve the Lord, come what may. Would you turn finally to Job 19? Job chapter 19. We know about Job. His story resonates. If you ever hear the story once, you'll never forget it. Job is a faithful man who loves God, and God allows him to suffer mightily and intensely. He'll lose all of his possessions, but more importantly, he'll lose all the people that worked for him, whom he loved. Incredibly, he will lose all of his children. in that pain, he falls down and he worships God. So turn, if you would, to chapter 19. I appreciate my brother Trey and his act of faith. Because I said, finally turn to this passage, and he's acting like I'm about done. And I appreciate that. As sadly misplaced as that confidence is, we've already lost an hour today, so what difference does it make? In Job 19, Job says something incredible. Now, Job probably lived about the time of Abraham. And the reason why I say that is what that means is he doesn't have what we have. He doesn't have the Word of God like this. The first 5 books in the Bible will be written by Moses, who lives after Abraham. So he's living, we call it the patriarchal age. He's living at a time where he is having interactions with God. He doesn't have this wisdom all compiled and stacked up where he can read it. So I find Job's faith stunning. I don't know his background story. I don't know where he originated from. I don't know how it was that he began to know God. I don't know how it was that he grew in such a way in his relationship with God. We just meet him as a man of faith in the first chapter. So Job endures everything around him crumbling. And he writes this in Job 19, verse 23. He cries out, "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book." And they have been. That with an iron stylus and lead, they were engraved in the rock forever. Something like 4,000 years later, we're reading his words. And then he says, "As for me." See, David said, "As for me, I'll install my king on the holy mountain." Joshua said, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Job, in his agony and in his struggle in his own body, he's been scraping himself with broken pieces of pottery, setting out in a burning pile of trash, trying to find some kind of comfort. He has no answers. He's been crying out to God, "God, would you just tell me why?" He says over and over, I just want my day in court. I just want to talk to him. And he's had 3 friends and then a 4th friend come with the same message. They came and they saw Job suffering, and they conclude that he has deserved it. Their message is basically, "Whoa, Job, what did you do that God is so mad at you?" They add additional burdens to the weight he's already carrying. Even his own wife says, "Curse God and die." Perhaps the worst part of this burden is the isolation. He doesn't have a single person encouraging him. Not one. No one. I can't imagine the intensity of his suffering, but I can't imagine how that's compounded by the isolation. What could be worse than all of your children dying and your best friends telling you it's your fault? How do you even breathe? The pain of loss, I can't imagine. And then your friends connecting the dots and saying, "It's because of your sin this has happened. So I've been so bad that this has happened to my children?" If you connect those dots, that's an impossible burden. There's no way. And Job says, let me tell you what, he doesn't have the explanation. At the end of the book, God blesses him, but he's nowhere near that in chapter 19. So it's in that context, it's in that moment, when nothing makes sense, when everything hurts, when the present reality is too painful to even try to comprehend. Here's what he says. Here's his one constant. Here's the one thing he knows. Verse 25, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. How does he know that? He doesn't have the Lord's empty tomb. He doesn't have Jesus telling Mary and Martha in John chapter 11, I am the resurrection and the life, that anyone that believes in me will live even if he dies. He doesn't have that like we do. And yet there is this constant, this yearning in Job's heart. He says, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. And because his Redeemer lives, so will he. Somehow beyond this, somehow beyond the flesh, past the time when our flesh is destroyed, when it is corrupted and returned to the dust from whence it was made. Beyond that, Job says, I know. Yet from my flesh, I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see and not another. And then he says, my heart faints within me. Sitting there on a pile of burning trash with scattered pieces of pottery around him, he says, just the thought of being with my God makes my heart flutter. I almost swoon with the expectation of being with him. As for me, is World War III about to begin? It has twice already. Really could. I was feeling okay about it, and my brother John Anderson pointed something out. He's a real sunbeam, positive, encouraging kind of fellow. And he said a couple of weeks ago, well, he says, if nuclear war breaks out, you'll be the first to know. And I said, really? And he said, well, yeah, because they'll probably blow up Midland because that's where all the oil comes from. So I went to Matador for a week and see how that would work out. But terrible things are happening, and more terrible things could happen. Are we living in the end times? Yes, we are. I just don't know how many there'll be. So what do we do? Well, here's what we must do. We must conclude this morning, as for me, as for you, as for us, may we install our King on the holy mountain. May we look to Jesus always. May we decide that we and our families and our households, that we will serve the Lord come what may. And like Job, can we say, as for me, we know that our Redeemer lives. When they were in the storm and Peter cried out for fear, he said, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And as Jesus stood on the water in the raging storm, he said to Peter, come. And Peter came. And Peter was walking on water. The storm had no effect. He was fine. And then he saw the wind and he became frightened and he began to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus grabbed him by the hand and lifted him up. And then he said, why did you doubt? As long as we keep our eyes on Jesus, we will never sink. As long as we keep our eyes on Jesus, we will never sink. So as for you, what will you decide? As together we stand and sing.